So after that first month with Mahaghosananda, he gave me a packet of tea and told me to go to Suan Mokkh to stay with Buddhadasa, and said the tea was for an old Chinese monk who lived there, who loved Krishnamurti and was a very interesting person. So I went there. I spent 3 months living at Suan Mokkh. The old Chinese monk, he called himself Mutti. He was known there as Ajahn Buddhadasa, and was a really impressive person also. So again, someone with a really clear mind. So you could sit and talk to him, and let's say 3 or 4 other people were there. He would have 3 or 4 conversations simultaneously, talking to each person, finishing, and then moving to the next person, then coming back to the first person and picking up where he'd left off. And he could take 4 or 5 people having different conversations, all of them interesting and relatively profound. Buddhadasa was also a really interesting person, for me anyway. And he had a kind of emptiness, coolness, or actually close to coldness, but wasn't a personal coldness. It was something like a coldness of a detachment, where you try to interact with people on a level of personality, and he wasn't interacting on a level of personality. He had no presentation. He had no persona, and that was something I found very interesting. I found it more authentic and true and real, not more comfortable, not something that was initially, it's a little bit frightening, potentially frightening anyway. But I spent most of those 3 months with Ajahn Buddhadasa, who was easier to relate to than Buddhadasa. So I'd see Buddhadasa every 2 weeks or so, and we'd have a little conversation. But Mutti had a really interesting story, and he was in his 70s at that time. When he first became a monk, it was at Suan Mokkh. He was 50 years old, and he'd spent 1 year at Suan Mokkh, and then gone and lived in a cave in the Khonsi Thammarat for 20 years by himself. And he was only back at Suan Mokkh several years at that point, because he'd been very, very sick, bleeding internally, and Ajahn Paul had gone to take him back to Suan Mokkh. And at the time, he'd asked for 1 more year to put his affairs in order before he went back to Suan Mokkh. And he was there under the condition that he not have to go to anything, not do any chanting, not do any religious rituals of any kind. Not that there were much at Suan Mokkh, but whatever there were, he didn't want to do it. And he had a kind of radical way of going about Buddhist practice that was very interesting for someone coming from the West. That it was a helpful way, as with Mahaghosananda, it was a helpful way to start seeing the Buddha's teaching as in a very close and direct way, and not as something to approach through forms and conventions, but something that you could approach in a very, very direct way, in a very personal and individual way, since each of them was doing it, in a sense, distant from the community and the traditions around them. Each of them had a very personal and individual approach, and that was easy to connect to. Buddhadasa was harder to connect to. Buddhadasa presented himself through a verbal teaching, whereas Mahaghosananda and Mutti would be there in their way of acting, their way of doing things, their way of being in the world, in a way outside traditions and outside of being explicators of the Buddha Dharma. So just talking in terms of their own perceptions, their own understanding, which could be anything, but often critical of the texts.